A bulk carrier crossing the North Atlantic in February is currently logging sustained winds over 74 miles per hour and a sea state with waves cresting near 50 feet. On board, dinner service in the crew mess has not stopped. This is not an emergency. This is the documented, ordinary operating reality of winter shipping routes that move the vast majority of the world's manufactured goods, and almost no one who unboxes a package ever thinks about the 400 meters of steel that crossed an ocean to get it there. Hurricane force wind is a specific defined threshold, not a figure of speech. Meteorologists classify sustained winds above 74 miles per hour as hurricane force, regardless of whether the system generating them has been named or categorized as a tropical cyclone. A deep winter low-pressure system in the North Pacific or North Atlantic can produce wind of that intensity without ever being called a hurricane, without a name, without the satellite coverage and evacuation warnings that accompany tropical storms. It simply forms, intensifies, and moves through shipping lanes that vessels are scheduled to cross on a fixed timetable, because global trade does not pause for weather the way most people imagine it should. This is the part of cargo shipping almost nobody outside the industry understands. The danger most associated with ocean storms, the named hurricane, the announced category, the satellite-tracked path, is the danger ships are specifically routed to avoid. Modern routing software, fed by satellite weather data, updated multiple times a day, identifies tropical storm systems days in advance and plots a course around them, sometimes adding considerable distance and fuel cost to stay clear. But winter extratropical storms, the unnamed systems that generate hurricane-force wind and 50-foot seas as a routine seasonal feature of the North Pacific and North Atlantic, cannot always be avoided the same way. They are too large, too frequent, and too central to the most efficient shipping routes between major ports. A ship that tried to route around every system of that kind every winter would add weeks to its schedule and would still, eventually, run into one anyway. So vessels are built and crewed specifically to operate inside that exact condition as routine, not exceptional, weather. The engineering behind that begins with the hull itself. A modern container ship or bulk carrier crossing winter seas is not simply riding over the waves beneath it. Naval architects describe a phenomenon called hull flexing, in which the vessel's structure is deliberately designed with calculated give along its length, allowing it to bend slightly under the uneven stress of a wave passing beneath the bow, while the stern is still supported by a different section of water entirely. A hull rigid enough to resist that stress completely would be more likely to crack under the load. The same engineering logic that allows a skyscraper to sway safely in high wind allows a ship several football fields long to flex by measurable degrees in heavy seas without structural failure, provided the sea state stays within the limits the vessel was designed and classed to handle. Classification societies, the independent organizations that certify a ship's structural design and seaworthiness, assign specific sea state and wind speed limits to every vessel based on its construction. A ship's master and the company operating it are expected to know those limits and avoid conditions that exceed them, which is the real reason routing decisions get made well before a storm arrives, not during it. The goal is never to test the upper limit of what the hull can survive. It is to stay comfortably inside a margin that has already been calculated and certified, with room to spare. Inside that margin, life aboard continues with a level of structural preparation that mirrors the engineering of the hull itself. Furniture throughout crew areas is bolted down. Galley equipment, stovetops, refrigeration units, and storage racks include raised edges and secure latching specifically rated for sustained rolling motion. Watertight doors throughout the accommodation block are tested and sealed before any voyage into a forecasted heavy weather system. None of this is improvised once the storm arrives. It is standard outfitting on every vessel that regularly transits these routes, present and ready regardless of the season, because the company operating the ship knows exactly which months of the year guarantee this exact condition. Crew scheduling changes as well. Officers responsible for navigation and the ship's safety increase the frequency of weather updates during a known heavy weather transit, sometimes checking forecasts and routing data multiple times within a single watch rather than once per shift. Maintenance work that requires a crew member to be outside on deck, securing cargo lashings, inspecting equipment, gets scheduled around the worst windows of the storm whenever the timeline allows, prioritizing the periods of relatively lower wind and wave activity, even within an overall multi-day weather system. None of this eliminates the storm's intensity. It manages the crew's exposure to the moments within it that carry the highest individual risk. There is a specific reason cargo ships can absorb hurricane-force wind in a way that would be far more dangerous for a smaller vessel, and it comes down to mass and length relative to wave period. A wave's danger to a ship is not just its height. It is the relationship between the wave's length, the time between successive wave crests, and the ship's own length. A vessel several hundred meters long, crossing a wave train with a shorter wavelength than its own hull, will often be supported by multiple wave crests simultaneously, distributing the load across a larger structure rather than concentrating it at a single point. A much smaller vessel in the exact same sea state experiences the waves differently, often pitching and rolling far more violently because its length is closer to the wavelength itself. This is part of the reason large modern cargo vessels, despite carrying immense value and crew aboard, are statistically more resilient in heavy winter seas than many people assume. While still respecting that resilience has hard limits, the crew and company actively work to never approach. The North Pacific in winter holds a specific reputation within the maritime industry for a reason grounded in measurable data, not folklore. Buoy and satellite records collected over decades show this region consistently generating some of the most severe sustained sea states anywhere on the planet, with significant wave heights in the 12 to 15 meter range recorded as a normal seasonal pattern, rather than a rare event. Shipping companies that operate trans-Pacific routes build their scheduling, fuel planning, and crew rotation policies around this expectation every single year, treating it as a known operating cost rather than an unpredictable hazard. What ultimately makes this entire system function is the gap between what the storm looks like from outside the ship and what the storm represents to the people who have crossed this same stretch of ocean dozens of times before. A first crossing through a genuine North Pacific winter system can be, by every account from crew who have experienced it, a deeply unsettling introduction to what the open ocean is actually capable of. A 20th crossing on the same route in similar conditions is logged, reported, and treated as exactly what the engineering and the procedure were built to handle. The wind is still hurricane force. The waves are still 50 feet. Nothing about the ocean has changed between the first crossing and the 20th. What changed is the same thing that changes in every extreme environment humans have learned to operate inside permanently rather than visit briefly. The gap between the raw, indifferent physics of the place and the accumulated decades of structural and procedural learning that now stand between a sailor and that physics every single winter on a route that does not stop, simply because the weather outside has a number large enough to frighten anyone who has never crossed it before.